I'm recently back from the second Fox Chapel open house held in Kinzers, Pennsylvania, where I gave a class on building a better bowl. Not just any old bowl, but making whatever bowl you decide to do come out as good as it possibly can. Some of these things that I'm going to discuss you may know, some you may know and have decided to ignore, and some may be new to you. And I'll be talking about ways of making it better, both in terms of the construction and also more interesting. I'm going to give you 5 points of each. So we're going to start off with building a better bowl as far as construction goes. The first thing is to keep the grain aligned. If you've been careless about drawing your guidelines, about aligning them with your pattern, about marking the tops, then you run the risk of having parts of the ring that are end grain on top of parts of the ring that are face grain and ending up with a mess. For a dramatic illustration of this, there's this pine unfinished bowl that had some interesting stuff right in the wood. There's not much you can do about that. It's all the way through. But if you have it lined up, when this is sanded and finished, it's going to look like a decoration. If you don't, it's going to look like a hodgepodge. If you want your bowls to look as though they're made out of a single piece of wood, it's absolutely critical to keep the grain aligned. And if you're going to do something with more than one set of rings, this little bowl here that appeared in a recent issue of Scroll Saw Woodworking and Crafts uses 3 ring sets, and you want to make sure that it looks as much like a single piece as possible to preserve the illusion that it was turned or carved. So that's the first point, is to keep that grain aligned. The second point is to eliminate spaces between the rings. Now, most of the time, rings are fairly forgiving. If you were to stack them, hold them up to the light, as is generally recommended, you might see little spaces through, the kind of thing that you can get away with in a less forgiving environment. And you say, all right, I'll mash them down in my bowl press, and it won't be a problem. Well, the problem comes, and I've seen this more than once on projects people have shown me, is that yes, you can mash the rings down, but when you try to put the rings that are now glued up and rigid on the base, you're going to find, if you look carefully, if I were to shine a light, you'll see light shining through. And that's because now you have 2 rigid parts that simply will not bend. And they are typically so far apart just enough so no matter how hard you squeeze it, they simply will not give. And you're going to end up with a little bit of a glue line, and that will spoil the illusion of a single piece of wood. So that what I typically do for this, I work ring by ring on a 12 by 12 granite tile, big box store stuff, with a piece of sandpaper, 120 to 150 grit, something like that, attached on top with a temporary bond adhesive, and I'll put it down on the surface. I'll tap it to see where it's rocking, which tells me where the high spots are, and I'll push down selectively until I put these together and they're absolutely flush. And if you do that, your glue-ups will be easier because you're not forcing them. And if you have to unclamp it to clean up squeeze out, there's no problem because you're not releasing pressure. It's not going to spring apart on you. All right, so step 2 is to eliminate spaces between rings before you glue them up. Step 3 is to even out the bottom of the lower ring. And this appears in almost every instruction that I write for a bowl. As you probably know, if you've made bowls, you glue up your rings first before you glue them to the base, because once you attach them to the base, you can't access the bottom of the ring without sanding ruts and things into the base and making it look like a steak board. So you look at your bottom, and you see if it's nicely contoured. That's what people will see if they look straight down into your bowl, and you don't want things looking irregular little bumps. Best way to see it, look at the back. There are fewer distractions, and any little irregularities will show up. And how do you get rid of it? Well, you mark the places that look like they need a little work. You hold it upside down, and assuming you're using a round sander in your drill press, you sand it gently just to get the uglies out. And once you're satisfied that the underside is nice and round, then you turn it over and do whatever damage control you need to do at the bottom so your side is nice and smooth. When you then glue this onto your base, all your inside work is done. You can safely allow some of the final tweaking on the upper part, because that you can access after it's glued up. But the lower part becomes completely inaccessible. Took me a couple of tries before I figured this out, but that's absolutely mandatory. Get that lower ring nice and evenly shaped. All right, point 4 is choose a profile for your upper ring, for the top of your bowl. The bowl has 2 faces, an outside face and an inside face. Both are sandable. If you sand them both evenly up, you're going to end up with a sort of a chunky look, which is nice if you want that look. But if you do that, it has to be absolutely even all around, or it's really going to look not nicely finished. And you do that by sanding the inside, sanding the outside. I like to use the Flexipad sanders on the outside, particularly for irregular shapes, and that round inflatable for the inside, until you're satisfied that it's nice and even. Now, if you want to get a thinner, more delicate looking edge, same shape bowl, but here I sanded the inside to meet the outer edge so it looks out flared. If I'm doing a bowl that has, well, this is out flared, I'll do the same sort of thing. But if it's in flared, I'll sand the outer edge to the inside to emphasize it. And that way you can get the illusion of a curve without doing any extra work. All right, so choose your top edge carefully. So the tops and the bottoms are critical. And the last tip for better bowl construction is do a final check before you start applying your finish. Feel your bowl. Feel your bowl without looking at it. And wherever you feel a little lump or bump, mark it and sand it. Do what you have to do to get it smooth. Check for glue spots. Use mineral spirits. Those will reveal glue spots. And before the mineral spirits are fully dried, use a white pencil to mark the spots. And that will find little random spots of glue that you may have deposited inadvertently, or glue between the rings. Sometimes it's very hard to see and will show up only after you finished it. So you do a final check, and if you find you're rushing to finish it, put the project away, come back the next day, fresh, look at it again, and when you're satisfied that it's as clean as you can make it, then you go ahead and put on your finish. All right, those are the tips for better construction. But you may say, well, I do a beautiful round bowl. I have no problem with that. It's not very interesting. How can I make my bowls more interesting? Well, the first suggestion I have is to vary the shape. Anything but round. Round, if you have a lathe, that's what most people do on the lathe, unless they're highly skilled. The scroll saw is limited only by how narrow it gets at the bottom. You have to be able to sand your bottom ring, but that's really the only shape limitation. So here is what has popularly become known as an Asian style bowl. Easy to do. I'm showing you shapes that are not tremendously demanding. And you can still do some of this on a belt sander, and it's not one of these little fidgety shapes. Or try an oval bowl, just a little bit off round. If you want to experiment making your own shapes, go to the website scrollmania.com, developed by an engineer scroller named Dave Van Ness, and you'll find a utility called Polydraw that is very useful for learning how to make the profiles for your bowls. And while you're there, look at his angle calculator app, which will very quickly give you the correct cutting angle for any ring width and thickness of wood with no trigonometry involved, and not even any simple formulas like I have in my book. It's quick and easy and really is the way to go. All right, so once you've decided on a more interesting shape, the lobe shapes are a little bit more complicated, but they're not terribly difficult to do. And in a single blank bowl that doesn't go curving in and out. It gives you a very nice, delicate shape that's quite easily sanded with a round inflatable, and just looks very, very pretty and very dressy. All right, so that you vary the shape. And while you're doing that, let's get away from those straight-sided bowls. Straight-sided bowls, which is a bowl cut at a constant angle, lacks interest. Most of what you see here are curved-sided bowls. There is a simple way to do this, and this is what I'm going to show you now. This is your typical 3/8 inch wide ring, 3/4 inch thick wood that takes a 27 or 28 degree angle. Well, on this one, I cut the first ring as you would typically, 28 degrees on the outside, build my entry hole, 28 degrees on the inside. Now my next ring is already 28 degrees on the outside because that's the way it came off of the first ring. But now instead of cutting the inside at 28 degrees, I drill and cut it at 35 degrees. Now when I remove that, the next ring, the outside's already 35 degrees. I cut that at 40 degrees. And then the base, I just cut at 45 degrees. And what happens there is that without a single extra cut, you get a very nice shape to the bowl that has a lot more interest than just a straight-sided bowl. The rings do get thicker as you go down, which gives you extra meat for curving in an interesting base, and is used in bowls where you're coming in curving ring on the top, and you want to sand it back so you get a little nicer rim. You don't want a knife edge. You want to have a little meat there for playing around with it, which is what was done on this bowl. This was one thick glued up ring that was cut at two different angles just to give me more meat to play. But this is the easiest way to get a curved bowl. There are more difficult techniques, but if you want something simple for starters, this is the way to go. All right, the next point is get away from using just one set of rings. One set of rings gives you a very nice bowl, but as soon as you start using more than one, this bowl used one set of rings for the bottom, a straight center ring, and one wide ring for the top. All of the variations that open up are enormous and very interesting. This bowl that recently appeared in Scroll Saw Woodworking and Crafts had 3 sets of rings. A bottom one, a straight one. Actually, it had 4. A bottom one, a straight one, an incurving one, and an outcurving one, which made it a lot of wood, but you also get a lot of effect. And this used the same amount, but cut more rings out of each ring set, so that this is sort of the little brother of this one. Both fun to do. This one is obviously the more challenging of the lot. But look at all the fun you can have playing. And if you don't like it when you stack it, then just eliminate the rings. And if you're going to put in other rings, use other ring sets, it gives you room for variation, for inserting color, putting in a laminated ring, all sorts of possibilities depending on what wood you have lying around. Right, then you have the option of carving the upper edge, carving with sanders, nothing difficult. Let me show you what I mean. This bowl was made with the same 5-petal pattern that I used on many of these others. The original edge was flat. What I did was, on this one, I actually cut it with a scroll saw. Got it in there and wiggled it and roughed it out and then sanded it. But for deeper carving, I used, this is the round inflatable sander, I just carved it down. And where you're going to get smaller, you can go to littler sanders, your little 1/4 inch Dremel, go down here, a carbide burr, and then your bowl starts looking as though it's carved and not scrolled. And the last suggestion I'm going to give you, let me clear the decks here so you can see exactly what I'm going to do. glue up some strips. Everyone has strips lying around their shop and doesn't know what to do with them. This was the glue up that I used for this bowl. These were 3/4 of an inch thick, these were 1 inch wide, the ones at the end were 1.5 inches, and I used an oval pattern. The reason the end ones were wider was that I wanted to have a little meat at the end for ease in cutting and handling. The reason you see a combination square on this is that after you glue things up, you have to sand it, and sometimes the thickness then is less than you started. Enough so that you need to adjust your angle, at which point you go to Scrollmania, you look at the angle calculator, and you readjust your cutting angle. No big deal. And this bowl was done by putting the oval pattern on the glued up strips, and then I inverted each ring 180 degrees around, and that gave me an interesting checkerboard effect on the side, and where the strips crossed the rings, you automatically generate curves. This is the easiest way to get swags, which are very dramatic, appear as if they're magic, and these are not that hard to align. So if you're interested in swags, this is a good way to start. So I have now given you 10 tips for relatively easy ways to move your bowls to the next level. Thank you for watching, and I hope this makes you eager to get out to your shop and build a better bowl.